I've been really looking forward to this up until today. When I agreed to do this about 6 weeks ago, it was like this, of course, simplest thing in the world. It's one of my passionate topics right now, working on this issue of World Heritage status. And as always, the time gets closer to do the presentation, and I'm realizing, okay, this is a public lecture, so I can't use my normal tricks with my students. And if you guys start getting bored, I can't say, this is going to be on the test. That's hardly going to work with you guys. And speaking louder doesn't always work. And the whole point of a public lecture is to be able to communicate. So with my students, I can always fake them out with some language I'm hoping they don't understand, that they think they're supposed to look up later. So, but the worst thing is, starting about noon today, I started receiving all these emails of people wishing me luck tonight. I'm thinking, first one or two were fine. And after a while, I've got about 6 or 7 deep into these. And I'm sure they weren't supposed to sound this way, but when I'm reading them, my voice is going, ooh, good luck tonight with that public lecture. So look, in the interest of good teacherly expectations, what I want to do is spend, I hope, not more than half an hour of talking to you, exploring this idea of the World Heritage Site. We've got a couple of key people here that are working on this site. There may be lots of questions about the process, how things are working, that my colleagues can answer. And I'm not sure if I'll cover the kinds of questions that you want. So hopefully in half an hour I can get through most of this and we can open it up. But before I get to the interesting stuff of the World Heritage Site for the Mount Lofty Ranges, what I do want to do is give some context, a little background of how I approach this, the things that have influenced me in thinking about agricultural landscapes and the role agriculture plays in development. So we're going to have to go back to where I was born and grew up, which is Arkansas. It's that green state in the south central, only green in color. It's hardly green in terms of anything else. It's one of the poorest states in the U.S. We compete with Alabama and Mississippi for the bottom of every single human development indicator that you can imagine. So performance in school is one of those, so any grammatical mistakes I make tonight, you can just put it to that. It's my teaching, my education. But one thing, it's a lovely state. It's about 3 million people now. It's about 2 million when I was there. I left when I was 18. But it's a state that values independence. It's not a state that the identity of the state isn't about cooperation, collaboration. There is no state agriculture. It's one of the 2 or 3 states in the United States that doesn't even have a state department of agriculture. Once you get out of the federally funded roads and a few state-funded roads, it's all gravel, and if it's muddy, it's too bad. Farmers have to get on with it on their own. Everybody's independent there. No cooperation. I think my mother would describe them differently as being ornery. But it's what I knew. It's what I grew up with. Left when I was 18, went mainly west and south, do my undergraduate studies. And when I decided to go back and do my PhD in agriculture economics, went right up the Mississippi River to another state called Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin is known as America's Dairyland. It was the identity, the collaboration for the state. It was settled by Northern Europeans, by Swedes, by Poles, by Germans. Had just a very different attitude, very different approach to the state. It was the first state to have a state income tax in the U.S. 20% of that budget of that state on average every year goes to support the public university, the University of Wisconsin. It's about 30,000 undergraduates, about 12,000 graduate students. Since the 1800s, all rural roads were paved in Wisconsin. If you were a dairy farmer, you had to get your milk out every day. In those communities, that state made sure that was going to happen. the identity of that state, the culture, what influenced their ability to spend money, to develop policies, to work on agriculture was very, very different. It struck me as being something very interesting and something useful that I've carried with me over time in terms of how important that is, what you can do, but how someone's identity, what you grow up with, what you're used to, influences how you act as a citizen and how you behave in terms of the policy sphere. The state produces about a third of all the cheese, quarter of all the butter. The only state that competes with it really is California, but California does it with big industrial dairy processing farms, where in Wisconsin it's the small 75, 150 cattle producers. And in fact, it's so efficient that in the 1930s, the subsidies on dairy products that the US put in place and are still in place today, the formula for deciding how much subsidy you would get, depending on where you are in the United States, was the distance you were from this one small town in Wisconsin. So a state very proud of that tradition. So proud, in fact, right when I was leaving in the early 80s, the governor of the state was having difficulties with the economy. All the jobs in car manufacturing was going off to Japan. The Harley-Davidson was even shrinking. Harley-Davidson's from Wisconsin. As governors tend to do, elections coming up, we need a diversion. So the governor decided, well, look, our license plate, the reg plates on the cars in the US, like here, like we have the festival state in South Australia, every state has a state motto, and on the registration plate, the license plates they call it in the US, was America's Dairyland. So the governor decided we need a new motto, we need to refresh ourselves. So let's do something different, let's do something new. And what he did was put out we're going to have a referendum. We'll get the three top, what the country think, or what the state thinks are the best three, and from those three, then we'll vote, and we'll have a new car registration, a license plate. Unfortunately for him, one or two came out. Of the three, the winner didn't work out so well for him. The one I actually liked the best was, the motto was, "We like it here." Sticking with the dairy theme, the second one was the state of utter delights. But the theme that won was a cow-shaped license plate with the motto, "Eat cheese or die." Which the governor obviously had to reject this whole plan and gone on to not being elected. But I have to say that whole experience, that state, that influence, the importance to everyone in that state, a very industrial state of agriculture, and that willingness to support it is something that is hugely influential. The second thing is, when I was just about to leave and go to Rome to work and leave the University of Wisconsin, I worked there for 7 years after I finished, there's a book came out by this amazing environmental historian. His name is William Cronin. And Cronin did a couple of really interesting things. He wrote a book called Nature's Metropolis, which describes the development and the history of Chicago. So Cronin grew up in Wisconsin, went to Yale, now back professor of history at Wisconsin. But among the things that he did is that he really broke a tradition in the way historians were describing settlement in the US and the way that cities, frontier, change over time. Because up until really 1990, when Cronin came out with his new approach, most, not all, but most of the theories were based on something very linear. You'd have this movement through the frontier, you would change, you would develop land into agriculture, that these were very frontier, independent people, like back in Arkansas. They could handle themselves. They were disconnected. Gradually, they'd adopt new technology, they would become more intensive. And what Cronin argued is that's not at all what happens. He used Chicago as the example, that in fact, cities and rural areas shape each other, that they grow together. And if we look at boundaries, political boundaries between a city and the rural area, that we're ignoring this shared world that they shape each other. And that started making me think a lot about the way we approach agriculture in most countries, and many of our policies about agriculture, which often are commodity specific. So we have a policy for grains, we have a policy for wines. But when we look at a landscape, the landscape produces many things other than just a commodity, a product. The other thing about that is that understanding how that landscape shifts through markets. What we want, what we buy, what we demand in Adelaide. If we want grapes, that landscape changes as people shift to grapes. If we want almonds, it shifts to almonds and olives and back and forth. So the market, in our case, very export-oriented, what the world wants, it changes that landscape. And Adelaide, the city, depends on what's going on that landscape because so many of the jobs come from that. So in one sense, it means that we're, in our own context here, we have political boundaries and an organizational system around local communities with boundaries on maps that are concerned about what's going on inside their boundaries. And we have a political system with elected people that are interested in state level or local level or federal level. But the coordination and collaboration that's going across that entire landscape, we're ignoring. And that's one of the big motivations that I think for us with the UNESCO that also has influenced our thinking and trying to push and get much more collaboration, that this isn't just about a rural area, it's about the city of Adelaide and this rural area because it's all one space. And for many of us here in Adelaide, we think about the hills, the Barossa, and the McLaren Vale, the areas close by, Mount Barker. These are areas that it's to me, it's quite a bit like a park. It's an open space. We visit, we drive through it. We love to look at the views. We take visitors there. We use it for all of those reasons. There's others of it that the bird watchers, they want the wildlife benefit that it provides. So there's all those different benefits that it can provide for us. So last part of background is then taking these ideas of how much culture influences our approach to agriculture policy, what we expect out of our agriculture in terms of its economy, and then in terms of how the other kinds of benefits that it can provide, these agriculture landscapes, that sense of place, that sense of identity, and how that shifts over time. In my work, much of it is in emerging economies in Africa and Latin America and Asia, and what I see are the approaches to agriculture are varied. Some countries I would describe as they just ignore agriculture. They want to ignore it because agriculture means something, there's no status in it. We need our own manufacturing. We need our own car industry. We need our own steel industry. And agriculture means we're behind. Others use agriculture, they want to exploit it. Brazil, Malaysia, we can get exports out of this. Let's plant palm oil. We can get jobs and we can get money. That's the only reason for it. Others like Australia, New Zealand, look at it, they liberalize. That's their approach. We let the market make lots of decisions and let these producers decide what they want to do and where they want to produce and how they want to produce. Other countries support agriculture and they look at it as a public good. Europe and Japan. So lots of subsidies go to their agriculture sectors. So very different approaches, but in that too are different ways over time that we want different things from our agriculture sector. So in really low-income countries, So here we're looking at, across this axis, per capita. It's the only graph, folks, so pictures after this. But conceptually, I think this is really important because as income goes up, the kinds of things we want from our agriculture change. When you're a really low-income country, 50% of your jobs are in agriculture, then what you want from your agriculture sector is very different from in Australia, where 2.5% of our GDP comes from agriculture. Maybe 20% of our GDP comes from agriculture-based industries, but we don't think about that so much. We just look at those jobs. So over time, what we want changes. So the poverty and food access issue from agriculture is you become higher income and you can afford food, you can import it, you can bring it in. That goes down. That's not as important. But what does become important, not important at all at low incomes, are those environmental attributes, the rural viability, the food safety, the diet nutrition aspects that we want out of our agriculture sector. So that changes, that shifts, and becomes important, and it's very related to our income. That's universal in terms of the way different countries approach it, but then what countries do about it, or within a country what they do about it, is highly influenced by those cultural aspects. So part of this, from an economic policy standpoint, is simple, because you can have policies that directly impact on those commodities or those producers. You can tax, you can subsidize, you can influence your exchange rate, you can influence your inflation rate, all these things that are direct to the producers. They do what they want. They benefit from their production, the income they can make, the value adding. What's difficult are these other benefits that we want from our agricultural landscape that are more like public goods, that the producers don't directly benefit. I may want to drive through the hills and see beautiful apple trees and vineyards uncovered, but I'm not paying for that. I may want the wildlife benefits, but I'm not paying for that. So how do we come up with policies and approaches that can help this aspect, this component, these things that we want as society that may be underproduced? How do we produce them? So from the economic policy standpoint, those are the challenges that we face. And there's these other kinds of issues that we have to deal with. Okay. That's the background and context. Now let's get to the World Heritage. When the 30-year plan was going on at its height, I was approached by the tireless Stephanie Johnson down in Port Wollonga, as part of the Friends of Port Wollonga, saying, we got a big problem because the land trust now, the government's going to be opening up all these houses in this beautiful area bordering some of the world's premier vines. And how do we compete? How do we compete with production? Growing houses versus growing crops is unbalanced. At the same time, Anne Moroney, the CEO of RDA Barossa, came and said the same question. They're moving into Gawler and Light with all these new houses. How do we compete? How do we build an economic case for protecting farmland? So what we did was we all got together and we sat down and we started making an inventory, looking at best practice. What do countries around the world do to protect their farmland? And there's lots of great examples of things that countries do. Australia is probably one of the few OECD wealthier countries that doesn't have a really coherent approach to this from a federal standpoint. It's part of our own history and the way the states are allowed. And even within the different states, you have lots of variation. But what we find is there are lots of zoning, and that's what happens in much of Adelaide, or much of the area from the Barossa down to McLaren Vale, Yankalilla, are zoning rules. So you're restricted on what you can do. It could be minimum size, it could be subdivision. All of the rules vary by council. It's not like there's anything consistent, so everything varies by the council. Other options that actually have been used are used quite a bit in other countries, but the tradable property rights, if someone has the right to subdivide their property, but we don't want them to subdivide their property, then we buy that right from them. So we pay what they could get anyway. They sign off saying, I can never subdivide my lease now, but you have to find a market for that, someone willing to pay for that has to pay for it. That was tried outside Mount Barker, but a very thin market and really never worked. There's right to farm legislation, which we don't have here, which is troublesome. I know of several winemakers in McLaren Vale that get a whiff of a Sydney lawyer wanting to come in and buy a piece of property in McLaren Vale so they can bring their friends in and show them this beautiful landscape. And their first weekend they get there in February and it's 2 o'clock in the morning and the machines are cranking up and the harvest is going on and they can't sleep, and so they're going to come in and start asking the council to change this rules and stop this. So there is no right to farm legislation. So you can change these rules, and many of these rules change. And it's been a big issue with zoning because lots of the producers throughout this region we're talking about recognize that, okay, the rule now is I can't subdivide, but every generation, they change the boundaries. And so I also can expect that to happen in our case. They're going to be changing these boundaries. And for these producers, this is their biggest, largest capital investment. It's their superannuation. Or for many of them, if they have the right to subdivide and you take that right away, it affects their finance because the bank will lend them lots of money if they have the right to subdivide their property. So they need that for working capital. So land trusts, land acquisitions, property tax based on use, and then all kinds of support systems. But what we found really was that, in fact, you could have the best legislation, best rules in the world. It didn't mean you were going to have profitable farmers. There were other things going on and other examples that we started looking at in the way that countries would promote their agriculture landscapes that were showing some success. It wasn't that they wouldn't dip during recessions, it's that they would dip less than all the other landscapes. So branding their landscapes in the same way that Appalachians or wine areas brand their landscapes. But countries, Spain, Italy, France in particular, were doing this outside of wine areas. Now more recently, in 2012, Minister Rao pushed through the character preservation in McLaren Vale and up in the Barossa to try to firm up the rules. And then just in the last couple of weeks, the environment and food protection areas were set up, which really didn't change any rules. What they've done is make it much more difficult for rules to change. So before the Environment and Food Protection Act, a minister could just sign and change the rules for subdivisions or for where rural housing could go. And now with this act, it takes both acts, it takes the upper house and the lower house have to agree before that's done. So there's just lots more transparency in that system. So those systems that have happened, those two laws, legislative acts in the last couple of weeks have been really important and really also very, very helpful to us with our World Heritage bid. Okay. World Heritage, most of you know this, UNESCO, a treaty organization with the United Nations. Australia was one of the first signatories. They set up in the 70s a way to recognize some of the world's most amazing places, okay, both natural and cultural. And they wanted to have a list. They set up criteria. The criteria have evolved over time. But most of the criteria are things that sound pretty amazing. Let me just read you a few. So the first criteria, you just have to make one criteria to become a World Heritage Site. The first one, to represent a masterpiece of human creative genius. Easy, right? Taj Mahal, pyramids. The very first building in the first 20th century building to meet this criteria is Sydney Opera House. Okay, so lots and lots of examples of that. To bear unique or at least exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition. To be an outstanding example of a type of building, architectural, technological ensemble. To be directly or tangibly associated with events or living traditions, with ideas. Then moving on to the natural ones, to be of outstanding examples representing major stages of the Earth's history, to be an outstanding example representing significant ongoing ecological and biological processes. Today, there's 1,031 World Heritage sites, 163 countries. 8 of those countries have about 40% of them. Italy has 51, 52 now. Spain has 44. China actually is the only one out of that European group. China has 48. China and Mexico. But you've got that top 8 or 9 countries that have the majority of them. Out of the 1,031, there are 80% of them are really cultural, and then 20% are the natural. And there's mixed that are both. So I don't know what this says about Australia, but Australia, there's 19. We really have 3 or 4 that are purely cultural, and all the rest of them are natural. So Kakadu, Tasmanian wilderness, the Great Barrier Reef. So we kind of are at the opposite of that. We haven't put as much influence or as much behind building up the cultural side. The most recent one is the Australian convict site, which is different areas, of course, not in South Australia, not being a convict state. So there's the list, the 19. We do have one in South Australia, the fossil mammal site, Naracoorte. And examples of agriculture sites, agriculture landscape, there's many of these, maybe 20, 25, well over half are vineyards. And even some of the ones, like the Australia convict site, has vines because one of the convict sites was a winery that was set up. So there's not the vineyards, but a winery. So lots and lots of association with vineyards. The Lavaux Vineyards was one of the first one. The rice terraces of the Philippines, the Douro in Portugal. This is the Val d'Orcia in southern Tuscany, which is the model that we're looking at. It was criteria 6. What's very different about the model that we're looking at than all the other agricultural landscapes except Val d'Orcia is that in Val d'Orcia and in ours, what we're basing our criteria on is being associated with a major event. All those other landscapes, their criteria is associated with something, the way those landscapes were managed for hundreds and hundreds of years, which essentially means they can't change because their value, their significance is because they've been managed in a special way, they look a special way, they have certain practices that they've evolved in Barolo and Piedmonte and Langhe. So all of these areas are associated with that. This is a significant difference in the approach we're doing because criteria 6 is about the event being tangibly associated with the event, just as the Val d'Orcia is. So it's a working, changing, evolving landscape. Doesn't have to look tomorrow like it looked like yesterday. So a key aspect of it. This is criteria 6. It's to be directly associated with events of outstanding universal significance. So our job, after we get national heritage, for the process is first you have to get national heritage. If you get national heritage, then you want the federal government to put you on the list for World Heritage. You go on a tentative list that you can be on and off of, and then the World Heritage Committee can select or not select that from that list. The time it takes can range from 10 to 15, 20 years. So it's a very, very long process that we seem to be stretching out to its limits. So what we have to do is we have to demonstrate that the event is of outstanding universal significance that we're tying the Mount Lofty ranges to, and that we're directly or tangibly linked to the site being nominated. Now, the event, most of you would know this history, the event that we're associated with is colonization. So essentially, you have Europeans influencing all the institutions that exist today, the political maps and boundaries that they've drawn, the way our systems work in terms of international cooperation. So a 500-year period of modern colonization. That's the event we're associated. What makes us different and special is the process that went on to establish South Australia, associated with the Wakefield Plan and all the different people that looked at it, that examined it, that said this is good, that said this is bad. Right? So there were several important ideas that were pushed in the Wakefield Plan. It went through many variations, but probably the most important thing about it was that the approach that was taken was, in fact, a system where people spent a lot of time evaluating what had happened over the past 450 years, what had gone wrong, how can we do it right? We're going to get it right this time. So when they decided to design South Australia, they set up around principles that would, and then had policies in place to match those principles. Okay, one of my favorite examples is that they recognized that across all the colonies in India, Canada, in the US, that one of the initial problems was that the inequality grew very rapidly. And that when you had that inequality, you would have a very few people that would become very powerful. So someone would move out and grab the best land. They would then become very powerful. They would own the governor. They would get the governor to give them the license for monopolies for all the economic benefits of that area, and that would lead to failure of those systems. And what they wanted was to say, look, how can we avoid that? Well, what they would do is have land rushes where someone would go out quickly, and if there was a water hole, they would claim that water hole. So they said, we'll avoid that in South Australia because we're going to title first. So if there's a water hole, we'll make sure we have 4 farms to get access to it. They also knew, especially with Bentham's influence early on, was the problem of dispersion. That what would happen is these colonies would go broke and require lots of money from England or from Spain or from France, because the people would move into the port of the main town like Adelaide, and then they would gradually move out, and you would have to support with trains or canals and more infrastructure as you would move out. So how do you avoid that? So they put in policies in place. For example, initially, if you owned a piece of property, which would have been maybe Burnside, then you would also have to own a piece of property in Adelaide, the city block. Every 80-acre section that you had to put a house on. Okay, so they had all these different policies that were set up to make this a self-sustaining colony. They wanted young people, they wanted people that would middle class, which actually meant they had a branding issue because colonies were just for poor people, they were for criminals, and they were for political refugees or religious refugees. So it had a bad name. So South Australia actually was initially a province, so they could sell it differently than a colony. And the whole idea of bringing in people and self-sustaining communities, like the Silesians from Prussia, was related to that direct policy. Now, it doesn't matter. Things changed very quickly, and what they had set up, and a great example of that was with the letters patent, because this was the first time that there was serious discussion about what it was going to mean for displacement of Aboriginals. So they set in place initially, we're going to provide land, so much land for Aboriginals, and there are examples, in fact, of, in Onkaparinga, at the head of the river, 4 titles that were given to Aboriginal individuals, but taken back after 4 years. Okay? But that discussion of recognizing that this was not wasteland, this was not terra nullius, this was something different in the whole approach to South Australia. So we have this amazing event of colonization. We were new, we were different, there were all these components of it, and there's lots of examples in our landscape that show that. So that's the basis of the bid that we're working on. The most difficult thing we've had isn't working with that part, with Ecomos and the other people explaining how our bid would work and what we would do. Really, the most difficult problem we have is working within the communities of why do this? What does it mean? What are the benefits going to be? So, again, a key part is that because our values, our universal value of significance is this event, it's not because this landscape looks a certain way that has to be maintained. So we've taken that out of the equation. Okay? What we need to do is find tangible evidence in the landscape, the Hoofendorf titling system that the Silesians were brought over and that they implemented, these communities that were set up, examples of those homesteads that were on each of those 80-acre blocks. Those are the things that we need that show and can tell the story about colonization. So that part's easy. The pro-growth, we see this totally as a pro-growth strategy in terms of its investment, tourism, branding, grants, and profile. So if any of you Google World Tourism, UNESCO World Tourism, you'll see huge opportunities with people around the world, maybe none of us, but people with lots of income do in fact spend their entire holidays going to see World Heritage sites around the world. So it brings in lots of high-yielding tourists. It would provide also a much greater emphasis on our Aboriginal heritage and the pre-colonization of our area. For me, the question is, why is Burgundy, Barolo, Champagne, Rioja, why are all these communities so adamant about getting World Heritage? I think answering those questions helps us understand why it might be beneficial for us. Burgundy and Champagne just got it. One extra reason for Burgundy, it isn't just that they want to be part of that large group, it's also because, or that elite group, it's also because it helps define their push for terroir. And in Champagne, it gives them more intellectual property rights status within their processing. So what we've also done then is we've looked, there's 4 major assessments, one by Price Waterhouse, a World Heritage Center did one, the Scottish Natural Heritage, and then James Rebanks did this one here on the World Heritage status. And James came here and spent some time, look at our situation, talked to us a lot. And what we learned from him actually is that really the whole idea of using World Heritage for economic purposes is very, very new. Initially, in the 80s, when World Heritage sites were set up, they were really all about protection. Okay, it wasn't until the 90s that people started looking and said, wait a second, we need to begin this process with clear socioeconomic motive. And in fact, all the plans now, you have to have plans on how you're going to handle tourism as part of your proposal for World Heritage. So it's a big key part of it. So what are the opportunities for gaining for us? These are the things we're trying to answer. We've had studies, amazing. Julian Morrison's done work on us to try to look at the benefits. Again, what's striking is, for me, is that no matter what scenario you run, the area, the branding opportunities, the jobs, the tourism, the investment, the public infrastructure, the profile that you get from it, the city of Adelaide gets 50% of the benefit in any scenario relative to the Barossa down through Yankalilla, which makes sense because of the way we're organized. That's where the hotels are, that's where the restaurants are. But getting Adelaide's attention on this project, even though they would be the greatest by far beneficiaries, has been difficult. Then there's other issues, I think, that for me, that are really important, just related to how we approach agriculture. Again, undervaluing it in this state. Over the past year, at different types of meetings with different visitors, we've met with people that are promoting Adelaide as the tech city, that part of the Cisco, the smart city, the Google city, the vibrant city. But all of these different initiatives have one thing in common. They're ignoring this agriculture landscape, what we have to offer. And there's so many things that could be built in. And the examples for me are the food, the health research, the diet, nutrition research that so many people are doing here in Bob Gibson and his group. So that should be tied in. We have amazing traceability technology that's being developed right here at the University of Adelaide. And it's not just the idea of being able to wave a monitor over food and know it comes from the Barossa, it's those systems, the traceability systems themselves that can be exported. So all of these ideas, the smart networks, the logistics organization, marketing, design, all of these things that the region from the Barossa down have to offer in terms of the skill set and the economic opportunities are being ignored by the city. And these are things that I think that we could spend a lot more time with and help develop. So this is the region that we're looking at right now, and I just learned from Step that Light Council and Claire have just come on board to join. So there's 8 councils now that are supporting the bid. The process for us is right now we need to get national heritage. In Australia, you have to have national heritage first. They have different sets of criteria and different rules than the World Heritage, UNESCO World Heritage. But we have to go through that process. So that's the step. The other step for us with the World Heritage is develop the links, the networks, to make sure that that group that makes these decisions understand and help feed into our bid process the key components, because it's an evolving thing. These criteria are never fixed in time. They evolve and change. And part of that will be the need for us to be very specific about what are these tangible things in the countryside that represent our link to that history, so that people know that boundary and what's included and how that might affect. Because what we're wanting is that to inscribe all the existing rules. It's not about new rules. So one of the big issues in the with all of the different producers is that their concern is that it will be a new set of rules. If they want to paint their shed, then they're going to have to go to UNESCO to seek permission. So a lot of this communication we've been doing over the last couple of years, gradually bringing people in. My last cultural story I'd like to share with you in closing is related to a trip a couple of years ago after we had spent, Steph and I, bringing these first councils in. This process is laborious because councils don't meet weekly. And there were 6 councils we initially went to talk to, and you would go and you'd say, oh, this is a great idea. We were seeking $10,000 from each of the 4 councils so we could get some money to put together the assessment, look at the cost-benefit analysis, our ability to get this whole project. So you'd go to the council and they'd say, oh, great idea. Look, why don't you come back and talk to our elected members? So you come back, you talk to the elected members, and they say, oh, that's fantastic. We love this. Why don't you come back and do a formal presentation? So we would do that. So that would take 3 months per council because they're not meeting. So we went through this whole process. In the meantime, we're meeting. With the wine guys, it was easy. It's a nanosecond, and they get it. They get the branding thing. They want to be part of it. With the cherry growers and the apple growers, it took 2 or 3 meetings. They weren't quite so easy to come and just and go along with us. But gradually, especially the younger, the newer ones, made those changes. After we'd finally got the money, we were doing the work, and I had some work in Germany doing a work with a project of the EU, and we had a week before that, Lauren and I went on our very first ever self-guided bicycle tour in Extremadura in Spain. And we went through this spectacular little area. Extremadura is just to the west of Madrid and borders Portugal. And we had just an amazing time. Lauren had to fly back. I had 2 days before I had to go to my meeting, so I went up to Segovia because there's a World Heritage site there. I wanted to go talk to people. Tough job, I know, but had to go check things out, see how they went through their bid and their management. I come back to took the train. They built all this amazing infrastructure. In 20 minutes, you can get to Segovia, 150 kilometers away. Came back, picked up at the airport, at the subway train station, heading to the airport. Taxi driver picks me up, unshaven, burly-looking guy, and we start chatting. He says, oh, what have you been doing? I said, oh, been having a great time. I went to Extremadura and spent all this time. He said, what was your favorite place? And I said, look, without question, our favorite place was this little town called Cáceres. which, by the way, was also named along with Adelaide as 51 places to visit in 2015 in the New York Times. So he goes, oh, Cáceres, he says, that's where I'm from. You're giving me goosebumps. You're giving me goosebumps. He says, did you know it's a World Heritage City? You know, I said, oh, yeah, I knew that. And he goes, oh, and he just goes over. It's a World Heritage City because it has these 30 towers that were built by the Muslims, and it has North Gothic agriculture, North Gothic architecture. And he goes on and on about all these different amazing things about his city. And I'm getting more and more depressed as this guy is talking to me about this whole thing. So he said, do you know, he says, what do you do in Australia? So, well, right now we're working on this World Heritage thing. Oh, how's it going? I said, well, not great. I said, we're having, difficulties convincing people. What do you mean? Who could not want World Heritage status? I said, well, look, you've got to understand it's different in Australia. You guys, you get massive amounts of support from your governments. Your farmers get huge amounts of support. In Australia, we don't do that. It's just a very different thing. He just was persistent. But it's your sense, it's your identity, it's who you are, it's your place. How could people resist that? I just don't understand it. Finally, we get to the airport. He jumps out, he runs to the back seat and pulls my bag out of the boot. And he says, wait, you have to take something. And he pulls out, he said, my mother just sent me this. It's the pimenton, the little, pepper, red pepper that they grow there. He hands this pepper to me and he says, I want you to take this. I want you to take this. And remember Cáceres. He grabs me by the shoulders and he looks at me and he says, please don't worry. You too in Australia in 500 years will have heritage. Somehow it made me feel better. Thank you very much.